Helen Beal, DevOpsologist at Ranger 4, a great, as I mentioned in the other channel just before the break, a great and vocal member of the DevOps community in London, in the UK, and across Europe as well. I know Helen speaks at a lot of different events, meetups, and conferences. I know Helen is also on the organizing team for DevSecOps Days coming up in London at the very end of June. So we're looking forward to more about that. We'll put a link for DevSecOps Days London in the Slack channel for any of you that that happen to be interested in that event and can make it over. But Helen, without further ado, let's have you kick things off here for the 2 o'clock track.
Awesome, thanks, Derek. So, hello everyone. As Derek said, I'm Helen. I work for Range 4. I'm a DevOpsologist, which is a job title I made up myself because in DevOps we don't really like job titles, so I prefer to think of it as a role descriptor. That what I do is essentially study DevOps. That's what I do all day, every day. So I do that with our customers. So we help organizations mature using DevOps principles and practices. We have a range of services that help do that, from capability assessments and various other workshops and training and games and coaching and all sorts of various different things that we do. But today I'm going to focus in on DevSecOps and specifically explore the foundational nature of artifact repositories in a DevSecOps toolchain. So I've got a short agenda for us. We're going to look at 3 things mainly. We're going to explore what's driving this thing called DevOps to begin with. Then we'll have a think about artifact repositories and where they sit in an organization and who uses them and when they get used. And then we'll look at DevOps toolchains in a bit more detail and DevSecOps toolchains and see what the relationship looks like between that and the artifact repository. So first of all, let's have a think about DevSecOps. So last year, I was at a conference in Belfast that was AppSec EU, and I was on the DevSecOps track, and I was talking about what is a DevSecOps engineer, as we've been developing a course for the DevOps Institute around specifically that. And speaking to some of my fellow speakers in the track, I was surprised to discover that not everybody was on board with the word DevSecOps, which surprised me since we were actually on a DevSecOps track at the AppSec EU event. But I did ask them what the issue was with it, and they kind of said, well, we think there's a danger that it could create another silo. People have a hard time understanding what DevOps is about sometimes anyway, and we're not sure there's a need for another thing. So I had a good think about that and chats with other people. And I kind of decided that actually I think there's very much a place for DevSecOps in the world. So DevOps, as you probably all know, is talking about trying to reduce the pain of segregated development and IT operations teams. So in the past, where they've been very siloed, we've seen lots of pain. Things like, I can't believe development are asking for admin access to production systems. I can't believe how long it takes operations to provision me an environment, all these sort of complaints about each other. So DevOps is set to try and help people become more agile and more lean and collaborate more effectively. And DevSecOps brings security into that mix as well. So I think one of the main reasons DevSecOps should be, if you like, allowed to stay or should be a key focus for us is because security has often been quite left behind in the DevOps debate. So DevOps has come quite a long way over the 10 years or so that it's been around, and we now often talk about it being about governance of the whole value stream, end to end, so everybody being involved in it. But security still did get quite left behind. So if you look at things like the DevOps handbook, security is mentioned last on the kind of subtitle. It's the last chapter in there. So what DevSecOps is trying to do is shine light on this element of the DevOps world and give us some more focus on it. And I often say it's a little bit like feminism. Until things are equal, we're going to need feminism. Until security is properly dealt with, then we need DevSecOps to help us give us more focus on it. So here are some kind of key principles around the DevSecOps world. The first really is that security is everyone's job. So everyone needs to take responsibility for understanding how they are securing their applications and how they are making sure they can't be breached. Earlier on in the year, Sonatype produced their annual State of the Software Supply Chain Survey, and we learned many, many things. I'll talk about some more later. But one of the things that we looked at was this constraint. So to every 100 developers, people often have 10 IT operations people and have 1 security person. We know that the security industry is massively under-resourced. You'll read things like 1 million security roles open worldwide and things. We know from our daily experience working with security teams in organisations that there's only a handful of them often, and they're very far away from us, and they're very busy, and they're very difficult to get hold of. They're very difficult to get time from. So it's a key constraint we're trying to address with DevSecOps. We're trying to get some security knowledge into everybody's heads. We're trying to automate it so that we don't have a people bottleneck. And then this next key principle is about shifting left. So we've talked about shifting left for many years in the context of testing. We know how much cheaper it is to remediate a defect early on in the software development lifecycle, and how much more expensive it is the further it gets downstream. And the same is true for a security vulnerability. We want to catch everything as early as we can. And we really want to take kind of the most grown-up, proactive approach to risk that we can. We want to mitigate it. We want to do everything we can to make sure it's there. We don't want to sign it off. We don't want to just go, let's try not to do that. We don't want to just insure ourselves. We want to make sure that we and our customers are properly protected. And then the final one that we have here is about nurturing safety culture. So we talk about culture a lot in the DevOps world. Many of you will be familiar with the CALMS acronym that we frequently use to describe what DevOps is about. And CALMS stands for culture, automation, lean, measurement, and sharing. This culture is a big part of what we do, and it's quite new in some respects in the IT world to have proper conversations about behaviours and feelings, and whether people are afraid of failure, whether people are blamed and punished for things that happen, whether people trust each other, whether there is respect, whether it's pride in work, whether people feel empowered, whether they have autonomy, whether people are properly able to learn and attain mastery, whether everyone fully understands an organisation why and shares it and are all on the same page, and whether people have purpose. There's many, many elements of culture that we need to look at. And then, of course, behind all of this, we're also in a world that's increasingly digitized and an exponential amount of threats coming our way all the time. So this stuff just keeps getting harder. So let's have a look at safety culture in a little bit more detail from a DevOps perspective. So I like to talk about failure quite a lot with our customers. Most organizations are quite bad at recognizing failure as a learning opportunity, and it's entirely understandable why that is the case. It's because as individual humans, we've all been brought up to feel failure is an embarrassing and humiliating thing that must be avoided at all costs. So to reframe failure as a learning opportunity is quite hard, but it can be done. So we have, if you like, when we're considering these failure conversations and these safety conversations, we need to think about the cultural and behavioural element, but also the systemic safety. So it's no good saying, right, everybody, we've empowered you to fail, go fail, and then everything breaks catastrophically. These two things have to go hand in hand, that people are willing, able, and fearless about experimentation. They're courageous about trying new things, but they are protected from doing anything awful. So on the left-hand side, I've talked about understanding and reframing that failure is a learning opportunity. So things we can do to help with that. People, Spotify, if you've seen the engineering culture videos, they talk about the fail walls. Lots of our customers experiment with fail walls and improvement walls, and putting things up there and making them visible and generating discussion about them and making improvements. Some organisations have awards for failure. Etsy have their 3-armed jumper. So other people have awards for kind of most dramatically failed project. Those awards are intended to recognise the adventure of innovation. We must ensure that accountability and goals are shared across and between teams, and that helps us not be in contention with each other and work together. We must make experimentation time explicit so we can write it in the product backlog so people know that they are empowered to experiment. Quite a common problem we see is that people know they need to empower their people, but the people haven't been empowered before. So their behaviour has learned not to do new things because they have not had permission and they've probably been told that's not their job previously. So it's actually no good telling people they're now empowered. We really have to help people know that they are empowered. We can have collaboration platforms, so very effective things like Confluence and wikis, and using things like ChatOps can help share knowledge, share learnings, share expertise. Another organisation has introduced almost like an amnesty around failure. So they discovered a tactical behavioural change technique of basically handing everybody a Monopoly get out jail free cards, so the leaders can hand out packs and people can bring them to the leader, and everyone knows that this failure is a learning opportunity, so there will be no shouting and there will be no blame. There will be a healthy investigation into what's going on. And then systemically, there are all sorts of things in the DevOps canon that help us here. They're around automation. So, continuous integration, we can say, don't, stop that if these tests fail. Deployment automation allows us to do things like redeploy last known good state virtually instantly should we fall into a problem. We can do limited blast radius, so we can have feature toggling and canary testing. We can use blue-green, test in live environments and switch between them as and when they become stable. We can use microservices, which again allow us to limit the blast radius. We can incorporate things like when an issue is raised in service desk, we can potentially automatically raise that into Jira, thus tightening that link and that loop between those two areas. We've got APM tools like Dynatrace and AppDynamics that can give us a lot of warning about when something is becoming unstable, so we can do something about it nice and early. I mentioned we've got ChatOps, so ways to bring disparate teams, geographically dispersed teams together to look at problems. And then increasingly, we're considering things like chaos engineering, so purposefully breaking things to teach us more about how to keep them running. So lots of things we can use there. So as I said, the next thing we're going to do is have a think about who uses artifact repositories. So I found this quote earlier on the Sonatype blog from Manfred. It's linked in the slides, which I'm sure we'll be getting to everybody at some point. So he says that manufacturing without a warehouse is basically the same as development without an artifact repository. And I just thought it was a wonderful analogy that, you would, as a manufacturer, you would not consider trying to make stuff without a warehouse full of parts. It just wouldn't happen. But sometimes in software, developers might just pick up bits of things here and there and perhaps not keep a collection of what's been used. So developers are the primary user of the artifact repository, and it is a place for them to keep all of the bits of stuff that they've got. So it helps us with things like version control, and it's essentially like a library or a bill of materials for what we've got. So I mentioned the Sonatype State of Software Supply Chain report earlier on. It came out a few months ago. I wrote an article on it, which is linked in this slide, which was about the importance of having an open source policy. And it was from really that article that the idea came to myself and Derek about this particular talk, about the foundational nature of the artifact repository in the DevSecOps supply chain. So in the report, we found things like in 2017, 64% of respondents said they had an open source policy, but 35% of them went on to say that they ignored it. Now, if we think back to one of the first slides where I talked about the 110.1 constraint around DevOps and security people, what tends to happen, we think, is that the security people are the ones that are setting the open source policy, and the developers are the ones that are expected to use it, consume it, and work from it. But for some reason, they aren't. So this kind of disconnect between development and security is evidenced in the statistics. It's in the data that we're seeing. So this kind of idea of security sitting on their own in an ivory tower and being very difficult to work with and being a bit of a constraint is felt. And I'm sure, and I know because I talk to security professionals, that likewise from their point of view, it doesn't feel like that at all. If we've read the Phoenix Project, you'll be familiar with the character John. The security people, it feels like they are being asked to do way too much stuff and people just don't listen to their advice. So there are two sides to every story. Other interesting parts of the software supply chain report, things like 38% of organisations had a complete bill of materials for each software application, which doesn't sound like many really, because wouldn't you want to know what you've got in everything? Wouldn't that be a good thing? And 62% do not have meaningful controls over what components are in their software applications. So they don't know what's coming in and out of their applications. So in terms of the supply chain hygiene, to keep to that sort of manufacturing context, this is pretty dirty. It's like we don't really know what we've got. So we don't really know whether our software is riddled with vulnerabilities. We can't be sure that we are mitigating risk. We can't really be sure about anything that's in there. I used this quote in that same article, which is from IDG, and IDG was saying this is when you need background to your open source software policy. And I just really love this because this is the scenarios where you might need to tell people a bit more about why you've got this thing. So first one, management doesn't know how much open source software the current company uses or depends on. And I think that's common to most organisations we work with. If you ask management, how much open source software do we use? You'd probably get a pretty blank face. You might even get what's open source software back from maybe not the IT management, but some people just may not know that there are implications of using open source that aren't just about vulnerabilities. And I keep on talking about vulnerabilities, but of course there's a whole aspect of commercial license problems that rock up here around the open source space as well. Something that looks free on the face of it often isn't when it's used in certain scenarios. And there are some very sizable cases and precedents out there of when software organisations have been charged by the open source people for being in breach of licence. The next one, there are widely varying opinions on how much open source software is used. I love the fact that the word opinions in there as well, not facts, just like I believe that there is this much open source and I believe that there's hardly any. Next one, there's an open source software rule or policy that conflicts with reality. For example, no open source software allowed, but your IT infrastructure is built on open source software. So how does that happen? Where someone states explicitly we're not having open source, and yet the whole IT infrastructure is built upon something like Linux. There are big disagreements on how the company should use open source software. So, should it be we're using free stuff in a tool chain? We're going to use components to build our core apps, our core mission critical apps. People may not be able to come to an agreement. So with all that in mind, so what we've learned about DevSecOps and what we've learned about artifact repositories and software cleanliness, software hygiene, let's have a think about where the artifact repository sits in a DevOps or a DevSecOps toolchain. So we use this a lot in our training, this excerpt from the DevOps handbook, which I basically put in today because I wanted to draw your attention to a couple of pieces in it. I know there's quite a lot of words there, but the first bit is basically saying that IT operations could and probably should provide a DevOps toolchain as a shared service. And the next bit is essentially giving us a list of things that we would expect that DevOps toolchain to be able to do, including having pre-blessed security libraries and security scanning tools, which are automatically run before deployment. So none of this kind of penetration testing after the event, none of this kind of manual, let's run that tool because we've just thought about it and that application has gone live. This is about automating that testing in the CI/CD process. So this is the DevOps Leap. So as it says on the right, this is the way at Range 4 we like to represent the DevOps toolchain. We represent it as essentially a continuous release cycle, and we represent it as a loop because we feel that it needs to be recognised visually that we are not going from A to B. It's not a linear process. We're going round and round this as fast as we can. You may have seen some other ones that are like a figure of 8 on its side, and I'm not particularly keen on them personally, because one side is usually dev and one side is ops. So we're forever keeping that separation between the two organisations or the two disciplines. But increasingly, I think the agreed model for a DevOps evolved organisation is to have product-centric, multifunctional, cross-functional people within a team. So we would have people with roles around things like site reliability engineering, alongside people with roles around development and roles around building things like infrastructure as code, or using code to produce the deployment pipeline or the DevOps toolchain. So we really don't want that separation. We want these blended. So this is an example DevOps Leap. So I've put some examples of tools on there that typically people are using. So what I've said is that the software starts here, and it's pointing at Nexus, the artifact repository there. We start the cycle from ideation. So ideation being the point that someone comes up with a requirement, and we put that requirement into usually Jira as a user story, and it becomes part of the product backlog. But when the hands hit the keyboards and something actually happens to make that software come alive, where we want to see that start is as something is pulled from or put into the artifact repository to become part of the application code. So then we've got going to be using things like GitHub to help us manage source control and version control, and TeamCity to help us do things like the automated build. And then we've got a couple of examples of Jasmine and Selenium and various different tools that we can run as part of our CI process, and then our CD process. And then we get to the thing being live. So that feature has been deployed as part of the continuous delivery lifecycle, and it's now effectively in operation. And what we're saying there is we do not want any vulnerabilities there. We do not want any vulnerabilities in live. So we need to catch them right back at the start, and software starts at the artifact repository. A couple of other tools and things on there, just some collaboration tools. I've mentioned Confluence and I think Slack already. SharePoint's obviously very popular around the world. And then we've got some monitoring tools. So just a quick note on the monitoring tools. What we're really wanting to do with monitoring is not just remediate problems, but also measure value and measure value outcomes. And you'll see that realization links back to ideation. So what we're saying there is what we want to be able to do is say, that thing that we wrote in Jira that we said would do this has or has not achieved what its value goal was. And therefore, we're going to take a learning opportunity and push that back into our backlog as either a revision to that thing that we did, or we'll kill it, or it'll drive us to do something new and related. So, as I said, keep on going around that loop. So, just going back actually where I was finishing here, really, software starts here. So this is where the software starts, at the artifact repository, and we definitely don't want any vulnerabilities here in operation. So we have to remove any bugs, any vulnerabilities, or any misunderstandings about what a software license might mean as early as possible in this part of the toolchain. So Sonatype make a product, which is our particular preferred product in this space, which helps us do just this. So we can build into the integrated development environment or IDE of a developer the ability to say that thing that you're pulling out of the artifact repository, that version of it is not great. Can you use this version instead? And you can find it here in the artifact repository. So that helps the developer. It helps the management and the security people get a bill of materials of what they have got in their software. So all those people that were saying, my opinion is that we've got 30% open source software in our organisation, we can start to address those conversations, and we can start to have some surety in the security team that the risk has been mitigated because they understand what they've got with what vulnerabilities and things have been changed. So we can understand the current vulnerabilities and risks. We can configure health checks to run daily, so we've got a real-time view of it, automated all the time. And we can, as I said, we can integrate it into the toolchain. So we can have it either at the developer IDE level. You could, if you didn't want to feel like you might be interrupting your developers, you could have it in your CI or your CD pipeline, so you could break a build off the back of it. Sonatype are constantly getting the latest news on what things are dangerous or not, and we can learn what our developers are likely to be using and using. And it's very, very accurate. So that was my explanation as to why we consider the artifact repository to be the key foundational element of a DevSecOps toolchain. Derek mentioned this at the start. I wanted to mention it as well. So DevSecOps Days is coming up at the back end of this month after the DevOps Enterprise Summit in London. We'd love to see you there. I will be there. I am on the organising committee. I am also speaking in the morning. Chris Roberts, as you can see there, is the opening keynote. We've also got Mark Schwartz from Amazon now, used to be CIO of US Customs, as the closing keynote. So it promises to be a really great day. So if you're planning to be at DUS or in London around that time, it would be absolutely fantastic to see you there. So thank you so much for your time and attention today. And I think we'll be going to the Slack channel next. Is that right, Derek?
Yeah, yes and no. So as the schedule works out, first of all, Helen, thanks for your presentation. It was awesome to view. We were also working in the background on our next session, which I want you to hang out a little bit for. I'll mention that as we move forward here. But one of the things that I wanted to go back and touch on from your presentation, you said management doesn't know how much open source is being used, and sometimes opinions on that vary. Earlier this morning we saw Barry Schneider at Fannie Mae talking about, they had 800 or so open source components approved to use in their environment before they started working with us, and then once they had, and they started analyzing that their application portfolio, they found out that they had 13,000 open source components across their portfolio. And today they have over 19,000 open source components actively cataloged in their environment. Now, of course, they're using those multiple times, throughout their environment. So just 19,000 unique artifacts. What's been your experience when you go into these clients and having that conversation about, do you really know how many are there, and how does that conversation go depending on who you're talking to?
People simply don't know the vast majority of the time. It's one of those kind of blank faces, and when you ask kind of without solutionizing for them how they might try and find out that sort of information, they start talking about people walking around and talking to people with clipboards, and then they kind of realize that actually, who are they going to ask? They're going to ask the developers, and are the developers going to know or have the time to really tell them? So people don't know. And then the other thing that shocks people, I think, is we've had instances with some of our customers where we've run scans of software that they have from a third party. So it's not even software that they've built themselves, but they can see vulnerable artifacts in that software made by other third parties like Betfair, for example, and stuff. So it's quite shocking and a little scary. And then we wonder sometimes why people don't act upon this stuff sooner. And I think there is an element of maybe not ostrich about it, kind of like sticking your head in the sand, but there are so many other things to do that this gets lost, and it becomes about kind of what's the risk of actually having a breach? Will that actually happen or not? And sometimes it almost takes the breach to happen for people to kind of really think about it. But as I said, this is about mitigating risk, really. So having software hygiene, and as you say, understanding. And what you were just saying about those numbers about Fannie Mae, they weren't really surprising at all. I mean, they probably got a bit of a surprise, but that's exactly the kind of what we're seeing is people just don't really know.
Yeah, so the other thing, this is a topic John Willis and I have been talking a lot about as we've intersected at different conferences over the last couple of months is, there's a kind of this somewhat surprise factor if someone actually, does the analysis and finds out how many open source components they have in their environment. But when you look at containers and, people using more Docker, people using Kubernetes or other container orchestration platforms, and they're rolling out containers upon containers. If you went to these same organizations and said, how many different containers do you have out in production or configured in your environment or available for use in dev, test, or ops? Do you think you would get the same answer of, I don't really know, we weren't paying attention?
I'm not sure. Do you think people are more likely to put something in like Dockley or something that will give them a management view of their containers? I kind of feel like people are generally architecting that more up front. I think part of what you're maybe alluding to is that this is part of a habit, like a historical habit that people have had where, and partly because they haven't had the ability to do it, that bill of materials has been virtually impossible to really extract, and developers have just gone on and kept on making changes. But I think from my observations, and I think containers are still really, really new. In all honesty, only a small proportion of our customers are experimenting with them. But I think, as with cloud, most people that are going into that journey are going into it with their eyes open and saying, we don't want this infrastructure to get out of control. So we will put a management process and some management tools in there in front of it.
Yeah, it was hypothetical conversation between John and I, but I just thought as the topic came up, I would share it. So
something to put in your state of software supply chain survey next year then, who's managing their containers and cloud effectively.
So speaking of the DevSecOps community survey that we ran, as we were going through the agenda, as you were speaking, we noticed that we had a gap between 2:30 and 3 o'clock when James Wickett was going to get on live. And so he said, do we just stop the conversation or do we fill it with something? So I'll give you the option of going off to Slack or staying here with us. James is on the channel. Mark Miller's on the channel. You guys can unmute yourselves as you'd like, but we're going to put up the slide deck from the DevSecOps community survey, and we're going to spend some time kind of running through it as just a panel. So Helen, if you'd like to join us for this, we'd love to have you on, and we'll walk through it, and we'll spend up until 3 o'clock until James is set to go live. We'll get going here. So Helen will be in Slack, but we're going to ask her to participate. Helen, are you up for it?
It's quite late here in the UK, but I can't really say no to such a nice invitation, can I? Yes, I'd be delighted to.